Welcome to the Global Marketing Show, the podcast for all things international business. I'm your host, Wendy Pease, president of Rapport International and a translation expert. Come along with me today as we talk to an expert in the global marketing world about facing their biggest fears, hearing about mistakes they made or saw, discussing best practices, and sharing fun travel, language, and culture stories. Hello, everybody, no matter where you are or what you're doing. Thank you so much for tuning into the Global Marketing Show. Another fabulous guest to introduce you today. I'm so excited to hear his stories because he's made some different life choices than other people that are in global marketing. So we're going to get some inside scoops. And just keep in mind, if you're enjoying this podcast, share it with somebody else. We're downloaded in over 40 countries now. So there's probably somebody in your network you know that has an interest in global business or global marketing or has a business that could be selling internationally. We started the podcast to help people figure out how to do it. All right. So today I'm going to introduce Adam Blanco. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited. Let me tell you a little bit more about Adam. He's a multicultural and multilingual executive with experience working in public and private sectors. He launched and managed economic development programs for USAID and worked in Russia as it changed to a capitalistic market. This is so interesting. So tell me, I know a little bit more about your background, and you seem to thrive in situations where there's political volatility and changing markets. Why would any organization or person want to launch in such a risky environment?
That's a good question, Wendy. I would call it borderline crazy. When I first went to Russia, I went as a Peace Corp volunteer. So there was a lot of idealism involved, and also the idea of going into an environment where there were also, of course, economic interests. When one considers the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union, I strongly believed that there would be huge economic opportunities there. Yes, the risks would be high, even today, probably more so today than it was back then. That's another story.
Wait, you faded out a little bit. You think that the risks are higher today than back then?
Let me back that up. The opportunities are not as great today as they were back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to do business in Russia today, you really have to have a good link into the government, be it the local government or the federal government. Mm-hmm. The opportunities are not what they were in the 90s and the 2000s.
So tell me, what did it look like? You went over as Peace Corps volunteer. What was your mission in the Peace Corps?
We were the first group of volunteers to Russia. We were a total of 102 volunteers, and our mission was economic development. We were sent to advise entrepreneurs, do business plans, help them raise capital, advise the local administrations on the privatization process. Although we were not formally involved in that, organizations like IFC, the World Bank, they were formally involved in those privatization programs of large enterprises, small businesses, even land privatization.
And what was your background to end up being part of this group that went to Russia?
I was a banker with Dresdner Bank, based in Miami. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, first the wall came down in Eastern Europe, and I had asked to be transferred to Germany, but I didn't speak German. And
Hmm.
in those days, really, Dresdner Bank, Deutsche Bank, the large banks, even the American banks, were not as international as they are today. So I was looking for ways to get to Eastern Europe. Russia was not on my radar originally. That came later when I saw an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal for Peace Corps volunteers, and it was specifically for Russia. And I had read a piece prior to that about a up and coming young politician by the name of Boris Nemtsov in the Nizhny Novgorod region, how he was doing reform. And I think the tipping point for me was advice that I had gotten from some friends, older friends who had been in the Peace Corps, and a counterpart who had left to open up the office in Russia for his law firm. So those were the two tipping points, I would say, that convinced me that was the place to go.
So
And I always had an international background. I grew up in a multilingual family. So for me, going into that kind of environment was not unnatural.
right. So you grew up in a family and you learned Spanish, of course, English, and then Portuguese. And your father was from the Basque region of France. So
My
you had
grandparents were from the Basque region of France and from the
your
Basque region of Spain. Yeah.
okay, so all of your multilingual background had nothing to do with Eastern Europe or Russia.
Correct. Yes, correct. But my grandparents were also quite influential in that their political views were Marxist and anarchist.
Okay, so you felt a little bit of draw to Marxism in Russia? Is that what pulled you over to that area, or was it
No, I didn't.
more?
I didn't feel a draw to Marxism at all,
Yeah.
or anarchism. Although one would say children are anarchists. Um,
If you're a parent, you'd agree.
right. Um, Certainly a curiosity, and I think it was more about the unknown and the curiosity of it all.
Okay. So now you're a banker. You apply to go to the Peace Corps in Russia. You get over there, and what's it like?
It was incredible. New culture, new language, wonderful people, and to this day, wonderful people in Russia. It's a beautiful country and
Mhm.
beautiful people, wonderful culture. It was, you could see the economic hardship. Literally people selling their silverware, their goods, their clothing on the street, literally lined up, and people are selling their wares. Think about having $100,000 in your bank account today, and tomorrow or in a couple of months you wake up and your $100,000 is worth nothing. And that is what happened to millions of people, pensioners and mid-career professionals. So you talk about reinvention, they really had to reinvent themselves. And a lot of them didn't make it.
What do you mean they didn't make it?
They didn't make it economically. They never recovered from that loss, many of them.
So I think of before the wall came down, Russia was you were either in the party and you were doing well, and so you tried to sing the party platform, and then the bottom falls out. Was it the party executives who didn't do well, or it was across the board who seemed to suffer the most?
No, the party executives, most of them didn't, but they're your average Soviet citizen, and I'm talking about Soviet citizens, not just Russia, Kazakhstan, all over the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
They suffered. They suffered hardships.
Okay, so
And
you're
go ahead.
walking into a country that you've got the mass of people. You're talking like the middle class
Yes,
and
that's right.
lower income earners. Just it fell out. They had nothing.
That's correct.
Hmm.
That's correct.
So when the wall fell down, I was actually traveling in Europe on an extended time off. I took 3 or 4 months and did the backpack and went through Europe. And I got to Hungary, and that was about the closest we could get to the Eastern Bloc at the time. And I just remember thinking that prices were so random. I mean, I joked with my traveling companion that it looked like somebody sat in a back room and wrote prices, and then somebody else went out and just stuck them on things, because there was no American value system of what costs more and what costs less. And so here you've got a population that has no money, capitalism starting to come in. How do we even look at that? And why would I have experienced this random pricing on goods that seem random to me?
Yeah. Well, you don't the the economy is being completely restructured. Your currency has been destroyed. So you literally start from scratch. Your infrastructure, the idea of credit to the consumer, that took a long time to establish. The infrastructure that supports commercial banking was non-existent in as we as we understand it in a capitalistic system. That didn't exist in Russia
So
or
how did
Kazakhstan or any of
what
those
did you do? Like, how do you
countries.
go in and restore this? I mean, to me, it seems unimaginable to start from scratch with that many
Yeah,
people and that much wealth already in the country.
yeah. Well, a lot of money was spent on technical assistance by USAID, the European Union, so the IMF, the World Bank. So you had armies of consultants and bankers going in to Russia to help them build that infrastructure. And over time, that know-how was then transferred to them, and they created a banking system. They created the infrastructure from
So
that.
what were you doing in particular when you were there?
As well as a Peace Corps volunteer, I worked with small businesses and I helped them write business plans. And we would take these business plans and market them in Moscow and try to raise money from the likes of the IFC, International Finance Corporation, the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and get investments into those companies.
What kind of
Other
businesses were you working with?
Well, those businesses, it varied. A brick factory was one, a machine tool factory that actually was part of the Soviet military infrastructure. That factory in particular was running at 15% capacity
Hmm.
and had laid off all of its workers pretty much. But the workers were still coming in to work, but they weren't being paid. They could not, the factory could not pay them. They didn't have the money to pay them.
Wow.
That was a restructuring that I had done together with Price Waterhouse. Part of that restructuring included establishing a Coca-Cola plant, and this was in Nizhny Novgorod. So part of the factory was, the territory was 49 hectares, and we divided up the factory and took a piece of that territory and built a bottling and distribution plant, Coca-Cola distribution plant there. And that created revenues for the local administration, created jobs, and it also provided revenues to the machine tool factory. However, the machine tool factory also, the technology that they were using was quite dated.
Hmm. Okay, so you're really talking about, the heart of the company, country, when you're talking about brick manufacturing, machine tooling, which just
Correct.
seems so difficult to believe in the United States that a factory like that Well, I guess you said they were outdated, they didn't have any money, and so you were able to get them money, partnerships with Coca-Cola, and they were able to restart.
Exactly, and that was part of the restructuring. You've got idle assets sitting there. What do you do with it? Well, you need to put it to work. So dividing up that territory and establishing a Coca-Cola plant was part of that. We also had
Mhm.
machine tool traders come in, and they bought a number of powerful lathes and machines in Europe. And so that was another cash generator for the factory. And they used that money to retool.
So you go in to help these companies, and you've got a great background to do it, and you've got some resources to support, yet you speak different languages in more that way than one. There's, of course, just the language. You speak English and Spanish, and they speak Russian. And then you speak capitalism, which is a completely different language too. That so how did you communicate across the primary, spoken language, but then also across these concepts you're trying to get across?
Yeah, Wendy, that's a good question. That's a very good question. It was a difficult transition for particularly the Soviet directors. The younger generation, they were the ones that took the reins and tried to move the country into a more capitalist society. Survival.
Okay. So they saw the American consumption or the Western consumption and knew that there was a market economy where I could sell stuff and make money, but I needed to sell stuff to make money. So where am I going to get the stuff to sell?
Exactly. Exactly.
Hmm.
And I would say it was not just American but European,
Right.
broad capitalism as a whole. Yeah.
That's why
Um,
I corrected I said,
and
US,
and
but then I said Western. So, but the capitalistic, yeah, good point.
and I would call what took place in the 90s unbridled, pure capitalism, which is not very pretty. There's a reason there are regulations. You really didn't have rule of law. Law was being made then as you go through the transition.
And so, what
It was a very
kind
difficult time.
of, I mean, there's no laws and laws are
There are
being
laws.
made.
There are laws, but the laws don't really not conform, but contribute to the environment of transition in capitalism.
So, what violation of these laws or expectations did you see that could have been most damaging?
Taxes, the taxation was a big issue in
Hmm.
those days. It was very high. It was you simply didn't have rule of law in those days.
So, taxes were high, but people didn't pay them because there was
People
no.
didn't pay them because you really didn't have an agency that could collect those taxes efficiently, and the businessmen always looked for ways not to pay the taxes.
Hmm. That then further hurt
There was a
the.
lack of trust between the business community and the government, and the government was very weak. That's changed. Today, the government is very strong. Tax collection today in Russia is very high. There is a level of civility, I would say, in Russia today, and there is proper tax collection. Having said that, rule of law is not applied equally. It's quite selective in Russia today.
Tell me more about that.
The good example of that,
The Yukos.
where Yukos Oil Company is a good example of that, where this was in 2003, I believe, that Mikhail Hodorkovsky was arrested, and the oil company was liquidated. and it was liquidated on the basis of the pretext was unpaid taxes. Now, that situation could have been applied to many other companies, but it was not. It was applied to the Yukos Oil Company.
Okay, so
And they did nothing in particular that was different from the other oil companies.
so why do you think they were singled out?
Because Mikhail Hodorotsky was a very powerful man, and he was getting involved in politics, which is something that at the time President Putin had warned the oligarchs not to do. Stay out of politics, focus on your business, and that was the issue.
Okay, so now back to the communication. So we kind of talked on the capitalistic language as the young people were very motivated to change, so they picked that up. How did you communicate when you didn't speak Russian and you were trying to work at a very high level over there?
Well, I had to learn Russian. So when I started there, the first 3 months I did go through Russian training. I was posted outside of Nizhny Novgorod in a smaller city by myself. So I had no choice but to learn the language. And I had to learn it very quickly if I wanted to eat.
Okay. All right. And so were there interpreters around at that point, or was there much English being spoken?
I did rely on a few interpreters, particularly when the discussions became very detailed. I did. But over the 18 years that I spent in Russia and Central Asia, I now speak the language quite well. And in fact, that's the la lengua franca at our house now is Russian. So my wife is Russian.
Your wife is Russian, you speak it, and then your children do, huh?
Exactly. And so does the dog.
Oh, that's great. All right, so you started out in the Peace Corps there, which is only a 2-year assignment typically.
Yep, that's right.
How did you decide to stay longer, or what did you transition to?
I decided to start my own business after Peace Corps. I did, and it was a consulting business. I had some opportunities to join larger organizations, but I decided to start my own business, and I consulted enterprises, small businesses. I would originate the projects out in the regions and take them to Moscow and partner up with larger corporations. A perfect example of that is the machine tool factory, which I had proposed to them a restructuring. I took the deal to Price Waterhouse, and we partnered up to do the restructuring of that factory. The Coca-Cola deal in that machine tool factory was separate from the restructuring with Price Waterhouse. And that's what I did for a few years. Then the crisis hit in '98, where the global economic crisis hit in August 1998. At that time, the bottom had fallen out in Russia, if you recall. And I took a position with a financial consulting group called Financial Services Volunteer Corps in Moscow as their country director. Well, actually, my first position was in the city of Samara. So I established our office in Samara. Our work was with the Central Bank of Russia. So we worked with the central bank in bank supervision, prudential supervision, as well as payments and regulation of commercial banks. So what we did was we organized conferences and seminars with the central bank in the regions as well as in Moscow.
And so this was mostly for Russian business owners to come and learn?
No, this was specifically for Russian commercial banks and the Central Bank of Russia.
So it was for banks to come learn about capitalistic financing?
not so much capitalistic financing, but I would describe it as prudential for the central bank. It was about payment system. It was also about commercial bank product, prudential supervision. How do you supervise commercial banking? What do we do in the West?
Mhm.
What are the policies that we follow, and what are the governing administrative normatives that we follow in the U.S.? How do we apply that to commercial banking?
So, off on a tangent, my mom went to study the prison systems in China, and so often from the West, we come in thinking, oh, we can bring the way we do it in. And she learned a lot of things that they do better, which is a whole other podcast, that we could bring to the United States. So I'm curious, here you go to Russia during a time that they're in complete upheaval and they have to learn a bunch of stuff. What do you think that Western capitalistic economies could learn from either what they had to put in or what they're doing now?
That's a good question, Wendy. I can say in my time there, I learned more about the United States. I learned as much about the United States as I did about Russia and
Hmm.
Central Asia. We here in the West, we are quite privileged. You have an infrastructure that's established. You have rule of law that's established. Doing that, establishing an infrastructure that supports an economy today, that's a very, very challenging process. When you've got 145 million people, and talking about Russia in particular in the 90s, and going through to today, Russia has made incredible advancements over the past 3 decades. In those environments, I think what one really needs to understand is they have their way of doing things, whether it be Russia, whether it be China, whether it be Nicaragua or Brazil. The culture is, one needs to take into account the culture, and how they have done things in the past may not be right, may not be the best for everyone, but there is a system. How do you change that system? Does that system need to be changed? The first question. And if it does need to be changed, how do you change that system? That's their decision, how they do that.
So you had to be very,
I don't know if I answered your question.
I wanted to get you more down into the detail, but I think what I heard is you're coming in as an expert from the United States and these other Peace Corps volunteers as experts in their area, and you're going to tell them how to do it. But what you learned is you can't tell them, you have to work with them to figure out what's going to work in
That's
their
correct.
culture and system to help drive the vision of what they want.
That's right, Wendy. You cannot go into these environments and tell anyone how to do things. You can only advise what are best practices and provide good examples of those. It is up to them to take that information and implement it, execute it the best they can in their environment.
Now, which countries have you worked in?
Russia, Tajikistan. Tajikistan is quite an interesting environment. Nicaragua, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Belarus.
And then you're working in the Balkans right now, right?
Yes, right now I'm working in the Balkans. I'm advising a digital bank in the Balkans. I also have a client in Ukraine that is aerospace related. Those are my two main projects right now. I also have a clean energy chemical specialty materials science, specialty chemicals business as well.
And now what are you doing for these companies? Why would somebody come and hire you?
These are relations that I have developed over the past 3 decades. The The digital bank is someone that I had done business with in Kosovo in 2009, 2010. And he's a banker, and he's based in London, and they have launched a digital bank in the Balkans. So my knowledge of Kosovo and in the Balkans in particular, given my work there, is what brought him to me. He came to me. Similar situation with the Ukrainian aerospace factory. That's with an American group that is doing business with the Ukrainian factory. It's a very large Ukrainian factory, and they asked for my assistance.
And what are you doing for them?
Helping them negotiate terms. I would say it's not so much the terms of the deal. It's not so much pricing. It's more about translating the ideas in the culture. There are so many miscommunications that happen, particularly by email. If you read the email in Russian, many Ukrainians speak Russian. The ideas do not translate literally into Russian. So a lot of it is relationship building.
So that's exactly what we were talking about before, where you have the subject, which is one language, and then you've got the language, which is another. So right now you're talking about it's not just the language, but it's also understanding the concepts.
Correct. That's right. To be fluent in a language, one really needs to be also fluent in the culture and understand that one can be perfect grammatically in the language, but not really understand what's being said if you don't understand the culture.
Yes, it's very interesting because when we go to hire translators, if they've learned their language in the United States and not the country where the translation is going to be used, we can't hire them.
That's right.
They have to have an understanding.
That's right. And even in Russia, you have different dialects, and for example, in the Volga River region in Nizhny Novgorod versus Moscow, Russian is spoken a little bit differently, and even all the way down the Volga River down to in places like Rostov-na-Don, Samara as well. A perfect example is the river Aka in Moscow. It's called the Aka, O-K-A. In Nizhny Novgorod, it's called the Ako, O-K-O. Okay, although it's spelled O-K-A.
Right.
O-K-O. So those small changes are important, but more important is really understanding the culture, because that's where the language comes out of the culture.
It does. It really does. So tell me more about that.
Don't know where to start.
Well, ironically, I just recorded a Global Minute. We do a social post called the Global Minute that goes out on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn every Monday. And I did one about how if you lose a language, you lose that culture too, because there's ways you express yourself in your history that if you don't have the cultural, like they're so intertwined. And one of them is there are 3,000 different varieties of potatoes in Peru. My dad sat on the board for the potato center there. And that's how I learned there were 3,000 potatoes. In the Quechuan language, there's a name for each of the different kinds of varieties. Like we can't even conceptualize that.
And it depends on the region where that potato comes from, and they may give it a different name than what you may hear it called in Lima, for example.
Yes.
Yeah? And something you pointed out, if you can lose the language if you lose contact with your culture. My original language, my mother tongue, was Spanish. I didn't learn English until I was 5, 6 years old. Today, my Russian is significantly better than my Spanish. Although, having said that, Really, what I need is just 2, 3 months. I can, I'm fine in Spanish, but I don't feel as comfortable in Spanish as I do in Russian. Sometimes when I get together with family, the Spanish speaking side of the family, Russian words will come out. I'm going 100 miles an hour in Spanish, and then suddenly, boom, Russian word will come out. And that's a function of not using the language as much.
Or there's not a word for it. I mean, I may have given this example
That is
before
true
in the
too.
yeah,
Yeah.
I grew up in first and second grade in Mexico, and the word pica means something spicy, where in English we'd say it's hot. So that could mean temperature hot or
Yes.
spicy hot. But I like to distinguish between the two. So I always told my kids, oh, this is pica. So they went to school, and in elementary school, they're in Spanish class, and they came home and they're like, Mom, did you know that pica is a Spanish word? It was just naturally in our vocabulary because we needed a word for it.
No, that's true. That's
Uh-huh.
true. We often in our house will have Russian and English mixed up. Happens a lot. Happens a lot. But the primary language at home is Russian. That's what we
So
speak
Spanish and
primarily.
English is Spanglish. I've heard there's a Portuguese and Spanish,
Yes.
Spanagese. What is
Yes.
Russian and English called?
A mess.
Oh, that's funny. Well, we'll have to we'll think of that. If you're listening to this on social media, put your suggestion down below. Yeah, so earlier we had talked about you had worked in Russia, Tajikistan, Nicaragua, the Balkans, and we were also talking about how you have to know the culture to make things work. So you've worked cross culturally. What what were the biggest challenges in each of the cultures of the countries that were most different from you? Like, where were the biggest struggles? And this is, so think about, you're talking to somebody that wants to go to another country to do business or wants to expand internationally. What were some of the challenges in the countries that you didn't expect or were surprising?
Well, let me start by let me start with how do you address the challenges? And the best way to address the challenges is to listen. Listen to what they are telling you. Listen sounds odd, but listen to how they live. Look at the environment. The biggest challenge that I had really was setting up a microfinance business in Tajikistan. The challenge was finding loan officers. The country had gone through a civil war, a really bloody civil war, where the clans were still, while there was peace, there was still some bad blood in many parts of the country as a result of the civil war. That civil war had really wiped out a generation of education. The educational system had collapsed. So particularly out in the provinces outside of the capital, Dushanbe, really it was difficult to find loan officers. What do I mean by difficult to find loan officers? Literally people who can do mathematics and read, basic need. And that was the result of the Civil War.
So what did you do?
We trained them. We looked for them. Most of the loan officers that I did hire came out of university in Dushanbe. Some were educated in Moscow. Out in the regions, we did find a few. They're out there. You just need to go out there and find them, and it's not easy. This is true in any, I believe, in any market that is going through a transition.
Even in the United States, there's so many companies that are struggle to hire now.
Right. Well, that's a different discussion entirely, and that's not a function That's capitalism being revised is the way I see it.
Mm,
But that's another discussion entirely.
that's a whole other podcast episode.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So we're getting to the end. I'd love to hear your recommendations for anybody who's thinking about global expansion, particularly into the politically changing or more volatile situations. And then we'll get into a few personal questions. So what would be your recommendations for anybody wanting to expand internationally?
Listen to the people on the ground. They are the ones that are going to tell you what's really happening politically and economically. You really, really have to be in touch with the locals to understand the market. Know when to get out of that market. Know what do I mean by that? While a market may look very lucrative, there may be political obstacles that just are very difficult to move. And you're not going to be able to get into that market, or you're already in that market. Things have gone very well, but you see that the environment is changing. That's happened in Russia. Today, most of a good portion of GDP is generated from the Russian government, not private business. So your opportunities have shrunk significantly there. And of course, it depends on the sector that you're involved in.
Yeah. Well, that's great
But
advice.
I think the main advice is have a good team on the ground. You have to have a good team on the ground. They are your eyes and ears in the business. They understand the culture, they understand the language, they understand what is going on.
How do you find somebody on the ground?
Have a framework. Have a framework. Understand when it's time to get out, when it's time to enter as well. What are the metrics that you have? What are the milestones that you have for that business in that country? Have those in place.
How do you find people on the ground?
Through word of mouth, through the universities, through contacts that you establish over time. Locals that are trained, that not only Western trained locals that are trained in the local businesses as well. You hire them, find them. How do you find them? You go into the country and you do your research. Spend some time in the country. Meet people.
Spend some time with them. Make sure that you have somebody you really like.
Exactly. You could always join the chambers of commerce and what have you, but those expatriate communities are just that. They tend to be isolated. You really need to get out there into the local environment, the local culture, the local business club and businesses.
That's great advice. All right, we're really running out of time now, but I want to ask you, what's your favorite foreign word?
Normalna.
What does that mean?
Normalna is a response in Russian when somebody asks you, "How are you doing?" Как у тебя? Как дела? Как сегодня? How are you? How's today? How are you doing? And the response generally is normalna. Normalna, the literal translation is normal. I'm okay. And it's reflective of the culture. It's reflective of Russian history. Remember, Russia was a land of serfs for centuries, as opposed to when you ask someone in the United States, "How are you?" "Oh, I'm great. Things are wonderful." Really?
But a lot of people in the United States who would answer that way haven't been serfs. They've had a different cultural experience.
Yes, that's right. And that goes to the point of understanding the culture. If you understand the culture and the history of the people, that'll give you a better understanding of the language and better command of the language.
Okay, how about favorite vacation?
Barcelona. And I would say Dubrovnik is a very, very close second, or close number one. Dubrovnik is a beautiful place in Croatia.
I've heard
Wonderful
Croatia
on the
is
Adriatic.
fantastic. So that's on my
And
list.
another beautiful place is Montenegro.
Oh, great.
I could go on. I could go on with a lot of places, but Barcelona is, for me, is number one. Spain is number one. I love Spain. I did my graduate studies in Barcelona, so I know the country. I know the city very well.
Excellent. So if anybody would like to reach you, what's the best way to do that?
Best way to reach me is by email. My email address is Blanco. It's Blanco.
AA, so double A.
Blanco at E as in Echo 8 as in the number, Q as in Quebec, technologies.com.
And your website?
E8Q technologies.com.
Excellent.
If there are any chess players watching, they would recognize E8Q as when the pawn gets promoted to queen.
I have wondered every time I look at your email, I have wondered what that means. So, okay. I am not a chess player. One of these days. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for
Yes.
being here. It's been a delightful conversation. I really,
Thank
really
you,
enjoyed
Wendy.
it.
Thank you for inviting me. I greatly appreciate the time that you spent with me and really enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. So if you're out there and you're listening, Adam and I met through an organization called IERG. It's International Executive Resource Group, which is a gathering of people who have had international experience. And there's chapters all over the place and they come together, a lot of them still for virtual meetings that you can get involved with and meet other people that have that global view. It's been very refreshing to me and I really enjoy the connections that I've made from them. So again, if you know anybody who might be interested in this podcast, please send it on to them and tune in to us next time. We'll have somebody new to talk about another experience in global marketing. Thanks so much for tuning in. That's a wrap for this session. A big thanks to you for listening to the Global Marketing Show. Hope you had just as much fun as I did. New sessions launch weekly on all places you find podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, and of course on our website. If you know someone interested in this topic, please tell them about us. Au revoir for now.